A white, racist police officer sat comfortably in the courtroom, legs stretched out, arms crossed, with a smug smirk spread across his face. He barely contained his amusement as his cold, blue eyes fixated on the black woman standing before the judge. His voice, dripping with arrogance, cut through the murmurs of the courtroom like a sharp blade. "Look at you," he sneered, shaking his head slowly, eyes scanning her up and down with open disdain. "Standing there all proud like you're somebody. Like this whole damn thing is gonna end in your favor." His voice was laced with condescension, and his colleagues in the back row chuckled, feeding off his cruelty. "They always bring you in here thinking they got a shot, thinking they're gonna outsmart the system, thinking their little sob story's gonna move the judge, but let's be real here." He leaned forward, placing his elbows on the table, his tone turning into an almost whisper, as if what he was about to say was some great inside joke only he and his fellow officers understood. "You and I both know how this ends. One less thug off the streets." The woman stood still. She didn't react. She didn't flinch. Her expression was unreadable, her dark eyes steady, locked onto his with an unsettling calmness. The judge, an older white man with years of bias etched into his gavel, barely looked up as he shuffled through the papers on his desk. He let out a long, exaggerated sigh, as if already bored of the proceedings. "All right," the judge muttered, adjusting his glasses. "Let's not waste time here. We all know where this is going." The officer grinned wider. "Exactly," he said, nodding, his voice thick with mockery. "They all go the same way." Another wave of laughter rippled through the officers in the back. A few spectators shifted uncomfortably, but no one spoke up. No one ever did. The woman didn't move. She didn't say a word. She simply let the moment stretch, let the weight of their arrogance hang heavy in the air. The silence was deafening, and something about it made the officer's grin falter, just for a second, just long enough for the first seed of unease to plant itself deep inside his gut. Then, she took a step forward. Slowly. Deliberately. Her hands, previously resting at her sides, moved with precise intention. She reached into the pocket of her blazer, pulling something out, holding it up for the entire courtroom to see. A badge. Not just any badge. The room fell into dead silence. The officer's smirk vanished. The blood drained from his face as his eyes locked onto the golden emblem, the 3 bold letters engraved in its center. FBI. The officers in the back stopped laughing. The judge sat up a little straighter. A ripple of confusion swept through the spectators, whispers breaking the silence. The officer blinked, his mouth opening slightly as if he was about to speak, but no words came out. The woman finally broke her silence, her voice calm, unwavering, carrying the full weight of power and justice. "By order of the Federal Bureau of Investigation," she said, her eyes never leaving his, "you are under arrest for corruption, conspiracy, and obstruction of justice." Gasps echoed through the courtroom. The officer instinctively glanced toward his colleagues, expecting someone to step in, to tell him this was some kind of joke. But no one moved. No one spoke. "Wait, what?" His voice cracked. He shook his head, forcing a nervous laugh. "This is a joke, right?" He turned to the judge, who was now flipping through his papers with furrowed brows, clearly realizing that something much bigger was happening right in his courtroom. The woman took another step forward, pulling out a pair of handcuffs. "Do I look like I'm joking?" The officer swallowed hard. His hands, which had been resting casually on the table just moments ago, slowly curled into fists. Beads of sweat formed on his forehead. He wasn't laughing anymore. He wasn't smirking. He wasn't speaking. She leaned in slightly, lowering her voice just enough for only him to hear. "You think you know how these cases end?" Her voice was steady, deliberate, almost mocking. She let the question hang, let him feel the shift in power, the slow, creeping realization that everything he had built, everything he had used to destroy others, was now caving in on him. Not this time. And in that moment, as the weight of his crimes crashed down on him, the officer, who had spent years mocking, humiliating, and destroying lives, felt something he had never truly felt before. Fear. But what was coming for him was far worse than fear. Because when the truth finally came out, what happened next left everyone in that courtroom speechless. Now, tell me, are you ready to find out how this story ends? Before we dive into today's story, I want to take a moment to send a message of strength and solidarity to every Black viewer watching this. Here on Plow of Twist, we stand firmly against racism, discrimination, and injustice in any form. This channel is about powerful storytelling, justice, and impactful twists that reflect the real world. Your voice matters. Your story matters. And today, we're telling a story that flips the script on injustice. Enjoy the story, and if you haven't already, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss a new twist. Now, let's get into it. The air inside the small-town courthouse was thick with the scent of old paper and polished wood, a smell that seemed to carry decades of biased rulings, whispered deals, and quiet injustices. It was the kind of place where everyone knew their role. The judge, an aging man with deep lines carved into his face, sat on the high bench like a king presiding over his domain. The jury, hand-selected from a pool of predictable faces, sat stiffly, their eyes moving between the defendant and the officer sitting smugly at the prosecutor's table. The spectators, mostly members of law enforcement and a few curious locals, were there for the spectacle rather than the pursuit of justice. And then there was her, Serena Wallace, standing at the defendant's table, her hands steady, her back straight, her expression unreadable. Serena had always known how the world worked. She had grown up understanding that, for people who looked like her, fairness was a myth, justice was a privilege reserved for a select few, and the system was not built for those like her to win. But she had also learned something else: patience was a weapon, and silence could be deafening. Across the room, the man who had dragged her here, Officer Daniel Reynolds, lounged in his chair as if he owned the place. He was the kind of officer everyone in town knew, charming when he needed to be, ruthless when no one was watching, and untouchable because of the badge on his chest. He had spent years patrolling these streets, playing the hero when it suited him, but behind closed doors, he was something else entirely. The type of man who had been given power and used it as a bludgeon against the people he was supposed to protect. Daniel was born and raised in this town. His father had been a cop before him, as had his grandfather, and in his mind, that made him royalty. This was his world, his court, his law. The idea that a woman like Serena Wallace could ever challenge him was laughable. He had arrested her himself. Dragged her out of her home in front of her neighbors, slammed her against the hood of his cruiser, and whispered in her ear, "Bet you never thought you'd end up here, huh?" He had smiled when she didn't resist, when she didn't fight back. He enjoyed watching them break. He enjoyed the way they went from proud to defeated in the span of a single interaction. The charges against her were flimsy, built on manipulated reports and exaggerated claims. It wasn't the first time Daniel had done this. He had perfected the art of making people disappear into the system, pushing paperwork that ensured their lives unraveled in ways that could never be traced back to him. A resisting arrest charge here, a planted piece of evidence there, it was easy. It was second nature. And it was effective because no one ever questioned him. No one ever challenged the officer with the clean-cut image, the one who shook hands with the mayor and took pictures with children at the town fair. Serena, however, was different. She stood in that courtroom with the quiet confidence of someone who had seen the world for what it was and had chosen not to cower beneath it. She met his gaze, unwavering, calm, and that was the first thing that unsettled him. He had expected her to be angry, to be desperate, to be begging. Instead, she was studying him. Measuring him. It made his skin itch. The courtroom was full, but it might as well have been empty. The way she held herself, the way she refused to react to the snide remarks, the whispers, the quiet chuckles, it created a pressure in the air that no one could quite name. Even the judge, who had seen hundreds of cases just like this one, seemed uneasy. Daniel was used to control. He thrived on it. The way he could step into a room and dictate the pace of things, the way his words carried weight no matter how wrong they were. But here, now, something was different. The confidence he had walked in with felt like it was slipping through his fingers, and he didn't understand why. He straightened in his seat, forced a grin, and leaned toward the prosecutor, whispering something that made the man smirk. It was all part of the game. The unspoken understanding between men who knew the rules would always favor them. He turned back to Serena, loud enough for the room to hear. "I hope you didn't plan on making any big moves with your life," he chuckled. "Because after today, the only thing you'll be planning is what prison job to take." More laughter. The officers in the back nodded, some nudging each other in quiet amusement. It was a well-practiced routine. A performance they had put on countless times before. Serena didn't blink. That was the second thing that unsettled him. There was something about the way she stood, about the way she carried herself, that made him feel, for the first time, like he had miscalculated something. Like he had missed a crucial step in the process. The judge cleared his throat, ready to move things along. "Let's proceed," he announced, tapping his gavel once against the wood. Daniel exhaled, rolling his shoulders back. Whatever moment of unease he had felt was gone. This was his world, and he knew exactly how this was going to play out. She was just another case, just another person who had the misfortune of standing in his way. But then she moved. It was subtle at first. A shift of her weight. A hand reaching into her pocket with the kind of ease that spoke of confidence, not desperation. And then he saw it. His breath hitched. The smirk disappeared from his lips. His fingers, which had been drumming idly against the desk, went still. Because in her hand, gleaming under the fluorescent lights, was something he never expected to see. Something that didn't belong in her grasp. Something that turned the entire courtroom into a vacuum of stunned silence. A badge. Not just any badge. And in that moment, as his stomach twisted and his palms began to sweat, Daniel Reynolds felt something new, something foreign. For the first time in his life, he felt powerless. And that was only the beginning. The weight of the badge in Serena's hand was nothing compared to the silence that followed. It wasn't just quiet, it was suffocating, pressing against every wall of the courtroom like the walls themselves were closing in. The laughter that had filled the space just moments ago had been swallowed whole, leaving behind an air so thick with disbelief it was nearly tangible. Daniel Reynolds stared at her, his mouth slightly open, his entire body stiff with something dangerously close to panic. His fingers twitched against the table as if his brain was trying to send signals his body couldn't quite understand. His pulse, steady and confident just seconds ago, began to thump hard against his temples. He had walked into this courtroom believing this was just another day, just another easy win, just another black woman caught in the system, her fate already decided before she ever set foot inside. And yet, standing there, unwavering, fearless, Serena Wallace had just shattered every assumption he had carried with him. He blinked, his tongue darting out to wet his suddenly dry lips. "What the hell is this?" His voice didn't carry the same arrogance as before. It was quieter, as if he was speaking just to her, as if maybe, just maybe, no one else had seen what he had just seen. But they had. Every single person in that courtroom had. Serena didn't answer right away. She let him stew in it, let the confusion settle in deep before she finally spoke. "You like to talk about how these cases always end," she said, her tone smooth, measured, dangerously calm. "But tell me, Officer Reynolds, how do they end when you're the one being charged?" The air crackled with tension. Someone in the audience audibly exhaled, as if they had been holding their breath. Daniel's face twitched, his confidence cracking. "This is a joke," he muttered, shaking his head. "This is some kind of sick joke." The judge, who had spent years presiding over cases where the guilty were protected and the innocent were punished, cleared his throat, but his usual authority was missing. His hands trembled slightly as he adjusted his glasses. What's going on here? He looked between Serena and Daniel, as if waiting for someone to tell him this was all some elaborate mistake. Serena turned slightly, but she didn't take her eyes off Daniel. As I just stated, Your Honor, she said, voice unwavering, Officer Reynolds is under arrest. Daniel slammed his hands against the table as if he could physically force the situation back under his control. You can't arrest me, he spat, voice rising in desperation. You're the defendant. He cut himself off, his breath hitching in his throat as realization finally hit. Serena smiled, but there was no warmth in it. Am I? Daniel looked around wildly, his gaze searching for someone, anyone, to step in and make this disappear. His fellow officers, who had once been laughing along with him, now sat frozen, eyes darting between him and Serena. There was no loyalty in their stares, no camaraderie. They weren't about to go down with him. The prosecutor, who had spent years building cases with Daniel, now looked like he wanted to be anywhere but here. He cleared his throat, fumbling with his papers. This is highly irregular, he muttered, trying to regain some control of the situation. Serena tilted her head slightly. You know what else is highly irregular? A police officer fabricating evidence. A police officer planting drugs on innocent people. A police officer using his badge to terrorize an entire community. But that didn't seem to bother you before, did it? Daniel clenched his jaw. You have nothing on me, he growled, but there was no strength in his words. It was a desperate grasp at an unraveling reality. Serena reached into her jacket and pulled out a folder. She set it down on the table between them and slowly slid it toward him. That's where you're wrong, she said. We have everything. Daniel hesitated before reaching for the file, his fingers hesitant, his breathing shallow. He flipped it open, and as his eyes scanned the contents, his face lost what little color it had left. Pages upon pages of reports, photographs, audio transcripts, all of it, evidence. Evidence of his corruption. His lies. His crimes. He flipped another page, and then another, his hands shaking. The air felt too thick to breathe. His heart pounded against his ribs, a caged animal desperate to escape. Serena leaned in just slightly, lowering her voice so only he could hear. How does it feel, she asked. Knowing that no matter what you say, no matter what you do, the verdict has already been decided? Daniel's hands curled into fists. You think this means anything, he hissed, but it sounded weak. You think you can take me down? Serena didn't flinch. I don't think, Officer Reynolds, she said. I know. The weight of those words sent a ripple through the room. The judge shifted uncomfortably, as if finally realizing the gravity of the situation. The jury, who had come in expecting an open and shut case, now looked like they had been thrown into a completely different trial. Daniel's breathing was uneven now, his mind racing, grasping for a way out. His entire career, his entire life, was flashing before his eyes, and for the first time, he was the one trapped. Serena took a step back, motioning to the two federal agents standing by the door. They moved forward, their presence undeniable, their intentions clear. Daniel shook his head. This isn't happening, he muttered under his breath, but he didn't move as the agents reached for his arms. His body had gone stiff, frozen in place by a fear he had never known. Serena watched as they pulled him up from his chair, the sound of metal clicking into place as they locked the handcuffs around his wrists. She saw the panic in his eyes, the way his chest rose and fell in quick, shallow breaths. But she wasn't done yet. She stepped closer, just enough so that only he could hear her final words. This is just the beginning. Daniel's entire body tensed. The room held its breath. And as the agents began to escort him toward the exit, the reality of what was happening finally crashed down on him. But what came next? That was something no one was prepared for. Daniel Reynolds had never felt the weight of cuffs on his wrists before. He had placed them on countless people, tight, unforgiving, pressing deep into the skin of those he arrested with a smirk, with a sneer, with the quiet satisfaction that came from knowing he was the one in control. But now, with the cold steel locked around his own wrists, digging into his skin, he realized something he had never truly considered before. He was just another man. The agents on either side of him gripped his arms, leading him away from the courtroom. His feet felt heavier with every step, his mind scrambling to process what was happening. Every face he passed was different now. The officers who once laughed with him, who once backed him up without hesitation, avoided his eyes. The prosecutor who had stood so confidently by his side minutes ago was suddenly silent, his hands clenched into nervous fists at his desk. The judge, the same one who had once ruled in his favor without a second thought, sat frozen, uncertain, as if realizing that this case had unraveled into something far beyond his control. And Serena Wallace, she stood still, watching him with the same unreadable expression, the same quiet patience. She had never raised her voice, never lashed out, never given him the reaction he had spent years forcing out of people like her. She had simply waited. And now, the patience had paid off. Daniel's pulse pounded in his ears as they reached the back hallway, the door swinging shut behind them, sealing him away from the world he once ruled. The dimly lit corridor felt impossibly narrow, the walls closing in on him, suffocating. He clenched his jaw, his breath coming short. "You have no idea what you're doing," he hissed, his voice low, his body tensing against the firm grip of the agents. One of them, a tall man with sharp features, glanced at him briefly but didn't respond. The silence was worse than any insult. "You think you're ruining me?" Daniel pressed on, trying to summon the confidence that had carried him through every trial, every hearing, every staged arrest. "You think this is gonna stick?" His voice wavered slightly, and that tiny crack in his tone sent ice down his spine. Serena's voice came from behind him, slow, deliberate. "It's already stuck, Officer Reynolds." His breath hitched. They turned a corner, leading him toward an interrogation room. The fluorescent lights flickered overhead, casting sharp shadows against the sterile walls. The sight of the metal chair in the center of the room made his stomach twist in a way he wasn't prepared for. "No lawyer," he barked, resisting slightly as they moved him forward. "I don't say a word without my lawyer." Serena stepped past him, turning just enough to meet his eyes. "Good idea," she said. "Because once you see what we have, you're going to need one." Daniel swallowed hard as they sat him down, locking his cuffs to the table with a heavy clank. The agent stepped back, standing near the door, their presence undeniable. The room was small, cold, designed to break people down. He had been in rooms like this before, on the other side, standing over men and women who he knew had no way out. Now, the table was turned, and the sensation was foreign. Uncomfortable. Serena took a seat across from him, placing a thick folder between them. She didn't rush. She let the silence stretch, let the weight of it settle over him. "Your whole career," she said finally, her voice steady, "you've been careful." She tapped her fingers lightly against the folder. "You covered your tracks, made sure nothing ever pointed back to you. You planted just enough doubt to get away with it." Daniel forced himself to smirk, though it felt weak. "You got nothing." Serena opened the folder, revealing stacks of papers, photographs, reports. She didn't shove them toward him. She let him look, let him see the edges of his own downfall before she even spoke again. "Money trails," she said, turning a page. "Bribes. Tampered evidence reports. You framed at least 17 people over the last 6 years." Another page flipped. "You think no one was paying attention, but the truth is, you just got lazy." She lifted a photograph, tilting it slightly so the light caught the image of him exchanging money with a known drug dealer, one he had supposedly put behind bars years ago. Daniel's stomach turned to lead. Serena leaned in slightly, lowering her voice. Do you know what the worst part is? She watched him, waiting, giving him the space to realize it himself. None of this was even necessary. You had power, you had influence, you had every advantage, and you still chose to do this. Daniel forced himself to breathe evenly. This doesn't prove anything. Serena tilted her head, studying him, and then reached into the folder once more. She pulled out a small recording device, placing it between them on the table. She pressed play. And his own voice filled the room. Clear. Undeniable. A conversation, one he had thought was private, one he had thought was buried beneath layers of lies. He heard himself laughing, heard himself boasting, heard the words that now sealed his fate. He listened as he detailed how easy it was to manipulate reports, how simple it was to make people disappear, how fun it was to watch them struggle while he walked free. His own words. His own undoing. Daniel's face drained of color. His throat felt tight. He tried to control his expression, but he knew, that Serena saw the exact moment the realization hit. You should have been smarter, she said quietly, pausing the recording. You should have known your time was coming. Daniel's jaw clenched so hard it ached. His mind raced, scrambling for a way out, for an excuse, for anything. But the walls had closed in. The net had tightened. And no one, none of his fellow officers, none of the men who once backed him up, none of the people who laughed at his jokes in the courtroom, was coming to save him. Serena leaned back, exhaling slowly. You spent years making sure cases ended the way you wanted them to. Her eyes locked onto his. So tell me, Officer Reynolds. How does it feel knowing this one won't end in your favor? Daniel's breath was shallow. His fingers twitched against the cold metal of the cuffs. And for the first time in his life, he had no answer. Daniel Reynolds had never known silence like this. It wasn't the absence of sound, it was the suffocating weight of realization pressing down on him, wrapping itself around his throat, making every breath feel shallow and forced. The air in the interrogation room felt thick, too heavy to inhale properly. His heart pounded against his ribs, his fingers twitched against the cold metal of the cuffs, and his mind raced in circles, grasping for an escape route that no longer existed. The walls that had once felt sturdy, walls he had built with years of carefully orchestrated power, deception, and manipulation, were now crumbling around him, piece by piece, leaving him exposed. Serena Wallace sat across from him, her expression unreadable, her posture composed, her presence commanding. She had barely moved, barely raised her voice, barely broken a sweat, and yet she had done something no one else had ever dared to do. She had stripped him of the very thing he had spent his entire life believing was untouchable. His power. His authority. His control. And she had done it without lifting a single finger in violence, without threatening him, without playing his game. She had simply let the truth speak for itself. And now, as it settled into the cracks of his carefully crafted facade, Daniel felt something he had never truly experienced before. Panic. It was slow at first, creeping along the edges of his nerves like a slow-burning fire, eating away at his composure, making his muscles tense beneath his suit. He wanted to speak, wanted to lash out, wanted to demand that this wasn't real, that this was some kind of mistake, some kind of setup, but the words died in his throat. He had nothing to say. And that realization alone was worse than anything else. Serena, on the other hand, took her time. She watched him carefully, her dark eyes steady, her fingers tapping lightly against the folder sitting between them. The folder. The one containing every misdeed, every lie, every piece of evidence that had turned the walls of his power into nothing more than a fragile house of cards. And now, with just one final push, she had sent it all tumbling down. You think this is enough to take me down? Daniel finally forced out, though his voice lacked its usual confidence. It was weaker, thinner, laced with a tremor he hated. He swallowed hard, tried to push past the dryness in his throat. You don't have proof of anything beyond a few conversations. Serena didn't flinch, didn't react, didn't show even the slightest sign of doubt. She merely raised a single eyebrow, as if she found his desperation amusing. "A few conversations," she repeated, her voice calm, steady. "You really think that's all we have?" She exhaled lightly, as if the idea was almost too ridiculous to entertain. Then, with the same deliberate movements that had unnerved him since the moment she pulled out her badge, she reached into the folder and pulled out a stack of documents, flipping through them slowly before sliding one across the table. Daniel's eyes flickered downward, unwillingly drawn to the bold black letters stamped across the top. Sworn affidavit. His breath hitched slightly, his fingers twitching as he took in the name at the bottom. Officer Mark Davis. For a brief, horrifying second, his brain refused to process it. His mind outright rejected the information in front of him. No. It wasn't possible. Mark was his partner. His ally. The one who had been with him through everything, through every cover-up, every fabricated report, every case that they had worked together to ensure ended in their favor. And yet, here was his name, signed in ink, locking Daniel's fate into place like a coffin being nailed shut. The betrayal hit like a gut punch, hard and fast, leaving him momentarily stunned. He blinked, his mouth opening slightly before snapping shut again. His entire body stiffened, his pulse hammering violently in his ears. "No," he muttered, his voice barely more than a breath. That's not possible." Serena remained unfazed. "You were sloppy," she said simply, as if this was nothing more than a casual observation. "You thought everyone in that department was just as loyal to you as you were to yourself. But people talk. People listen. And eventually, people get tired of cleaning up your messes." Daniel gritted his teeth, his fingers curling into fists against the table. His jaw clenched so hard it ached, his muscles burning with the effort of keeping himself from completely unraveling. He couldn't let her see it, couldn't let her see how deep the panic was running through him, how fast his mind was spinning, trying desperately to claw its way out of the inevitable. "So that's it," he forced out, his voice tight. "You really think this is how it ends for me?" Serena didn't hesitate. "I know it is." The sheer certainty in her tone made his stomach twist into knots. The door to the interrogation room creaked open, and another agent stepped inside. "We're ready to move him," the man announced, barely sparing Daniel a glance, as if he wasn't even worth the effort of looking at anymore. Serena gave a slow nod, gathering the documents and standing up. "I hope you enjoyed the courtroom while you had the chance," she said, her voice even, unreadable. "Because where you're going, you won't be sitting on the winning side of the table ever again." Daniel's breath hitched, a cold sweat forming along the back of his neck. Every instinct inside him screamed at him to do something, to fight, to protest, to deny. But there was nothing left to fight. No one left to defend him. No system left to protect him. The agents on either side of him reached down, gripping his arms, lifting him to his feet with firm, unyielding hands. The movement was sudden, final, sending a sharp jolt of reality through his spine. This was real. This was happening. And there was nothing he could do to stop it. As they turned him toward the door, Serena's voice came again, softer this time, but no less sharp. "Do you remember what you said to me the day you arrested me?" Daniel didn't answer. He didn't need to. He remembered it all too well. Serena let the silence stretch, let him sit with the weight of it before she spoke again. "You told me people like me never win. You told me the system would always work against me." A pause, heavy and deliberate. "I guess you were right about one thing. The system is broken. But today, it finally worked against you instead." The finality of those words sent a violent chill through Daniel's body. His chest rose and fell in short, uneven breaths, his hands tightening into fists as the agents led him toward the exit. Every step felt heavier than the last. Every breath felt tighter. Every sound around him, every shuffle of movement, every click of a camera, every hushed whisper of the agents escorting him away, felt like a hammer driving the final nails into the coffin of his life as he knew it. And for the first time in his life, as he was led through the doors and into the blinding chaos of flashing lights and news cameras, Daniel Reynolds understood what it truly meant to be powerless. The sound of the heavy steel door slamming shut behind Daniel was deafening. It echoed through the holding area, a final, resounding punctuation to the life he had once known. The walls around him were dull, gray, lifeless, far from the polished wood and grand authority of the courtroom he had ruled over for years. This place didn't care who he was. It didn't care about the badge he had worn, the connections he had built, or the power he had wielded. Here, he was nothing more than another man in cuffs, another name on a list, another case file moving through the system he had once manipulated to his advantage. The two agents escorting him barely spoke. Their grip was firm but impersonal, their steps calculated and efficient. They had done this before. They had walked men just like him down these halls, men who thought they were untouchable until the ground was ripped out from under them. Daniel could feel the weight of their indifference pressing down on him, suffocating him more than the cuffs on his wrists. He wasn't special. He wasn't feared. He wasn't in control. They led him to a small, dimly lit processing room, where a cold metal bench awaited him. He was forced down onto it, the cuffs still tight around his wrists as they began the routine. His fingerprints were taken, each press of his fingers against the scanner feeling like another piece of his identity being stripped away. A camera flashed in front of him, capturing his face in stark, unforgiving detail. His name was entered into the system, not as an officer, not as a figure of authority, but as a prisoner. The weight of it all settled into his chest, thick and immovable. He had spent his career making sure he was on the right side of these walls. He had laughed at the men who sat in these very chairs, had taken pleasure in watching them squirm as they realized their lives were over. Now, as the same cold reality wrapped itself around him, he realized how little any of that mattered. No one was coming to save him. The door creaked open again, and Serena Wallace stepped inside. She didn't rush, didn't gloat, didn't throw words of vengeance in his face. Instead, she simply stood there, her eyes locked onto him with the same steady calm she had held since the moment she revealed her badge. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The air between them was thick with something unspoken, something heavier than mere justice or revenge. Daniel swallowed hard. His voice, when he finally spoke, was quieter than he wanted it to be. "You think this makes you better than me?" He forced a smirk, though it felt foreign on his lips, as if his body no longer remembered how to shape it. "You think this changes anything?" Serena didn't react. She studied him, taking in the exhaustion in his posture, the tension in his jaw, the way his fingers twitched against his lap as if he wanted to fight but no longer had the strength to do so. "This was never about me being better than you," she said after a long pause. "This was about the truth catching up to you." Daniel let out a dry, humorless chuckle. "The truth," he echoed, shaking his head. "That's rich, coming from someone who had to go undercover just to make a case." Serena tilted her head slightly, as if considering his words. "You want to know the real difference between you and me?" She leaned forward slightly, just enough for him to feel the weight of her next words. "I never had to lie to win." Daniel clenched his jaw, his muscles tightening with frustration. He hated how steady she was. Hated how unshaken she remained while his entire world was collapsing around him. "You don't know what it's like," he muttered under his breath, his voice raw, edged with something dangerously close to desperation. "You don't know what it's like to be the one who has to keep order. To be the one people look to for control." He exhaled sharply, shaking his head. "You sit there, acting like you're some kind of hero, but you don't understand. People like me, we keep things running. We do what needs to be done." Serena's expression didn't waver. "At what cost?" Daniel didn't answer. He didn't need to. They both knew the answer. She leaned back slightly, exhaling. You spent years making sure the system worked in your favor, she continued. You built your career on bending the rules, on making sure people like me stayed exactly where you thought we belonged. Her gaze darkened slightly. But you never considered what would happen when the rules stopped protecting you. Daniel looked away, his jaw tightening, his mind racing through every move he had ever made, every case he had manipulated, every man and woman he had put behind bars not because they were guilty, but because it was easy. He had told himself it was for the greater good, had justified it in his own mind. But sitting here, cuffed, waiting for the next step in a process he could no longer control, he felt the weight of every decision pressing down on him like a slowly tightening vice. Serena stood, smoothing out the front of her jacket. You should get comfortable, she said, her voice quiet but firm. Because this is just the beginning. Daniel's stomach twisted. He watched as she walked to the door, pausing just before stepping out. She turned slightly, her eyes meeting his one last time. You always thought the system would protect you, she said, her voice almost contemplative. You just never realized, you were the one it needed to be protected from. And with that, she stepped out, leaving Daniel alone in the cold, unforgiving silence. His breath came slow, uneven. His mind raced, grasping for a way out, for an angle he could play, for something, anything, that could reverse what had already been set in motion. But deep down, beneath the layers of denial and defiance, he knew. There was no escape. There was no way back. For the first time in his life, Daniel Reynolds wasn't the one calling the shots. And that terrified him more than anything else ever had. Daniel sat in the cold, sterile room, his wrists still cuffed, his back pressed against the uncomfortable steel chair. The walls around him felt smaller, the air heavier, as if everything in this place had been designed to crush the people inside. His mind was spinning, grasping at every loose thread of control he had left, but the more he searched, the more he realized there was nothing. No escape, no last-minute favor, no loophole he could exploit. This wasn't like the courtroom, where a well-placed lie or an exaggerated report could turn a case in his favor. Here, there was nothing but the truth, and it had never felt more suffocating. The door creaked open again, and for a brief second, his heart pounded in anticipation. Maybe someone had come to fix this, maybe one of his old friends, one of the guys who owed him something, would step in and tell him it had all been a mistake. But when he lifted his head, it wasn't a friend standing there. It was Serena. She walked into the room with the same controlled poise that had unnerved him since the moment this nightmare began. There was no gloating, no smug grin, no satisfaction in her expression. That was what made it worse. She wasn't here to rub it in. She wasn't here to celebrate. She was simply here because this was justice, and for the first time in his life, Daniel Reynolds was on the wrong end of it. She pulled out the chair across from him, sitting down with an ease that made his skin crawl. The silence between them stretched, long and heavy, and for the first time, he wasn't sure if he wanted her to speak or not. He wanted to lash out, to throw something back at her, to find some way to make her doubt, to make her feel something, but every second that passed only reminded him that he was no longer the one with the power in the room. Serena studied him for a moment, then exhaled slowly, as if she were gathering her thoughts before speaking. I wonder, she said finally, her voice calm, even, how many times you sat in this exact position, watching someone else sit where you are now, knowing they didn't stand a chance. Daniel clenched his jaw. You think this makes you any different from me? He forced a smirk, though it felt hollow. You're sitting there, watching me go down, acting like you're better, but the truth is, you're doing the same thing I did. You're just on the other side of the table. Serena didn't blink. The difference, she said, is that I didn't have to lie to put you here. Daniel let out a sharp breath, shaking his head. This whole thing is bullshit. You think you're exposing some deep, dark truth. You think you've uncovered some massive scandal. The system's dirty, Wallace. It's always been dirty. I just did what needed to be done. He leaned forward slightly, his eyes darkening. You want to stand on your high horse and act like you've never crossed the line. That you've never bent the rules to get what you wanted. Serena met his gaze without hesitation. I have never ruined innocent lives for my own benefit. I have never planted evidence to justify an arrest. I have never enjoyed watching people suffer. Her voice was steady, but there was something in her eyes now, something that burned, not with rage, but with conviction. And that's the difference between you and me. Daniel laughed dryly, shaking his head. You think the world cares about the difference? You think the people out there, the ones who still believe in cops like me, are gonna see it that way? He smirked, but it faltered at the edges. People don't care about right and wrong, Wallace. They care about power. And if you think for 1 second that you won't have people out there defending me, then you don't know how the world works. Serena tilted her head slightly. You're right, she admitted. There will be people who defend you. There always are. People who will pretend the evidence isn't there. People who will say this is some kind of political stunt. People who will find ways to justify every crime you've committed. She leaned forward slightly, lowering her voice just enough to make sure he heard every word. But none of them will be able to stop what's coming for you. Daniel exhaled, his smirk fading entirely now. You don't get it, he muttered, shaking his head. This isn't about me. This is about control. You think putting me away changes anything? You think there aren't 100 more cops just like me out there, waiting to take my place? You think one trial, one case, one conviction changes how the system works? His voice had an edge now, something bitter, something desperate. You think you win just because you take me down? Serena studied him for a long moment, then slowly shook her head. No, she admitted. Taking you down doesn't fix everything. It doesn't undo the damage. It doesn't bring back the people you hurt. It doesn't erase the years of corruption that have seeped into every corner of this system. She exhaled. But it's a start. Daniel swallowed hard. The door opened again, this time with 2 uniformed officers standing in the doorway. They didn't hesitate, didn't wait for an argument. One stepped forward, unlocking his cuffs from the table, while the other adjusted the restraints on his wrists. Serena stood, watching as they pulled him to his feet. You thought you'd never have to answer for any of it, she said, her voice quiet but firm. You thought you were untouchable. And maybe for a long time, you were. Daniel clenched his jaw, refusing to speak, refusing to give her the satisfaction of seeing him break. Serena took a small step forward, just enough to meet his eyes one last time. But look at you now, she said softly. Just another name in the system. Daniel felt something sharp twist inside his chest, something that burned, something that he refused to name. The officers began to lead him away, their grip firm, their steps unyielding. And as he walked through the doorway, his hands bound, his future no longer his own, Daniel Reynolds finally understood something he had never considered before. He wasn't just in the system anymore. He was trapped in it. And this time, there was no way out. The cold metal of the handcuffs bit into Daniel's wrists with every movement, a constant reminder of his new reality. His steps felt heavier as the officers led him down the long, sterile hallway, the fluorescent lights above flickering slightly, casting shadows that stretched and shrank as he walked. His uniformed escorts didn't say a word, didn't acknowledge him beyond their firm grip on his arms. He was no longer one of them. He was no longer a man they respected, no longer an officer whose orders carried weight. Now, he was just another prisoner. The silence was unbearable. It gnawed at him, stripping away the arrogance, the defiance, the belief that somehow, this was all a mistake. He could still feel the way Serena had looked at him, the quiet certainty in her eyes as she told him the truth he had refused to accept. This wasn't just about him. It was about everything he had stood for, everything he had built his career on, and how, in the end, it had all come crashing down. The hallway led to a set of heavy iron doors. As they approached, one of the officers pressed a button on the wall, and with a loud, mechanical groan, the doors slid open, revealing a stark, gray holding area. The scent of sweat, concrete, and something stale lingered in the air, and Daniel felt his stomach twist as the sight before him fully registered. Rows of holding cells lined the walls, each one filled with men who had been processed before him. Some sat in silence, staring at the walls, lost in thought. Others paced, their footsteps echoing against the hard floor. And then there were those who noticed him, who really noticed him. Their heads turned, their eyes narrowing as recognition dawned. Daniel felt his breath catch in his throat. He knew some of these men. He had put them here. The murmurs started almost instantly. Low voices, whispers that spread through the cells like a slow-moving wave. Faces appeared behind the metal bars, some watching with curiosity, others with barely concealed amusement. And then came the laughter, quiet at first, then louder, rippling through the room like an inside joke finally being shared aloud. Well, a deep voice drawled from one of the cells, filled with something that wasn't quite amusement but wasn't quite anger either. Look who finally made it to the other side. Daniel refused to look. He kept his gaze forward, his jaw clenched so tightly it ached. His pulse pounded in his ears, but he forced himself to keep walking, to ignore the way his skin burned under their stares. Another voice, this one sharper. Ain't this poetic? A dry chuckle followed. How many of us you shoved in here, Reynolds? And now look at you. The laughter grew, some of it bitter, some of it triumphant. He could feel it clawing at him, breaking through the last remnants of control he had left. His own voice echoed in his head, words he had thrown at men like them, words meant to break, to humiliate, to remind them that he was the one in charge. You think anybody cares about your sob story? You don't belong anywhere but behind bars. The system works just fine. You just don't like when it works against you. And now, those very words turned against him, mocking him, suffocating him. One of the officers guiding him finally spoke, his voice low. Keep walking. It wasn't for Daniel's sake. It was for control, for keeping the situation from spiraling into something worse. Daniel exhaled slowly, forcing himself to take the last few steps toward the empty holding cell waiting for him. The officer unlocked the door, the heavy metal groaning as it slid open. Daniel hesitated for just a fraction of a second, one last, desperate moment before stepping fully into this new reality. Then the officer gave him a slight shove, and he stumbled forward into the cell. The door clanged shut behind him, the sound final, like a gavel striking down the sentence he had spent his life believing he'd never receive. He turned slowly, his hands still cuffed, and met the gaze of the men watching him from the other side of the bars. Some were shaking their heads, some were smirking, and others just looked at him with something unreadable. Then one of them, a man Daniel had arrested years ago on charges that he knew damn well had been exaggerated, stepped closer to the bars, resting his arms against them as he studied him. Tell me, Reynolds, the man said, tilting his head slightly. How's it feel? Daniel didn't answer. He didn't have to. Because for the first time in his life, he knew exactly how it felt. The days blurred together, time moving in a slow, suffocating crawl that Daniel Reynolds had never experienced before. The world he had once commanded with confidence, the system he had twisted to his advantage, had now fully turned against him, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. His name had become a stain, his face plastered across every news outlet, his legacy ripped apart by the same media that once painted him as a dedicated officer of the law. The truth was out, and no matter how many statements his defense team tried to spin, no matter how many desperate attempts were made to shift the narrative, nothing could erase the evidence stacked against him. The trial had been swift. The prosecution had been relentless, methodical, presenting a case so airtight that even the most corrupt judges couldn't ignore it. Witnesses came forward, former officers, victims, people who had been silenced for years but now had the power to speak. And when the verdict came down, when the words guilty on all counts echoed through the courtroom, Daniel barely reacted. He had already known. The real punishment had begun long before that moment. The sentencing was severe. Decades behind bars. No parole. No leniency. No second chances. The same system he had once manipulated had shown him no mercy, and for the first time, he understood what it was like to be on the receiving end of the very thing he had wielded against so many. The prison he was sent to was not filled with nameless criminals, strangers he had no connection to. It was filled with faces he recognized, men whose lives he had destroyed, men who had been sent away by his lies, men who now looked at him with the same cold detachment he had once shown them. There was no escape. Every day was a reminder, every glance, every whispered comment, every chuckle from a distant corner. He was no longer feared. He was no longer respected. He was nothing. Meanwhile, outside the prison walls, Serena Wallace walked free, her name now synonymous with something that carried more weight than vengeance, justice. The case against Daniel had sent shockwaves through the system, rippling far beyond the confines of that small-town courtroom. Investigations were opened. Corrupt officers, once shielded by the same blue wall of silence that had protected Daniel for years, found themselves exposed. Some resigned quietly, slipping away before the storm could reach them. Others weren't so lucky. For Serena, this was never about personal victory. It was about balance, about righting a wrong that had gone unchecked for too long. She had not celebrated the verdict, had not reveled in the downfall of the man who once mocked her as if she was beneath him. She had simply moved forward, knowing there was still more work to be done. Because while Daniel Reynolds was behind bars, the system that created him was still standing, still waiting for the next man who believed himself untouchable. And Daniel, in his cell, his name reduced to nothing more than a cautionary tale, could do nothing but reflect. The arrogance, the power, the confidence that had once defined him had long since eroded. He saw now what he had refused to see before, that the people he had crushed under his boot were not faceless, nameless obstacles. They were people. They had lives, families, dreams, and he had taken all of that from them without a second thought. And now, stripped of everything, he had nothing left but time to sit with the weight of what he had done. But the world outside did not stop for him. The same community he had terrorized now moved on, free from his influence. His name, once spoken with authority, now only came up in conversations as a warning of what happens when corruption goes unchecked for too long. The system had swallowed him whole, just as he had done to so many others. And perhaps the greatest irony of all was that there would be no redemption story for him. No second act where he found a way back to power. No last-minute salvation. His fate was sealed, his legacy set in stone as a monument to his own downfall. And so, as the lights dimmed in his cold, windowless cell, as the voices of men he had wronged echoed through the halls, Daniel Reynolds came to understand the one truth he had spent his entire life denying. Justice, real justice, had finally found him. And it did not forgive. Now, let's talk about this story. How many times have we seen men like Daniel Reynolds walk free, their crimes buried beneath a system designed to protect them? How many stories have gone untold, how many lives have been shattered without consequence? And yet, there are moments like this, where justice prevails, where the truth refuses to be silenced. This story wasn't just about one man's downfall. It was about the power of persistence, the strength in fighting back, and the undeniable weight of the truth when it finally comes to light. So, tell me, what did you take away from this? What did this story make you feel? Drop a comment and let's talk about it. And if you want more stories filled with twists, justice, and unexpected endings, don't forget to subscribe to Tales of Twist. Hit that notification bell so you never miss a new story, and I'll see you in the next one.